The wrong campsite. I never wanted to go camping, but my friends insisted. It'll be fun, they said, a weekend away from everything. I had my doubts, but they wore me down. So there we were, 4 of us crammed into a car, heading deep into the woods for what was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. The drive took longer than expected. By the time we found a spot that seemed good enough, the sun was already sinking behind the trees. The place looked perfect at first, quiet, isolated, and surrounded by tall pines that seemed to reach the sky. We unpacked, set up our tents, and gathered some wood for a fire. As the flames crackled and we settled down, I started to feel like maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Then I noticed the sign. It was old, barely visible in the dim light, but the words "no trespassing" were clear enough. I pointed it out to the group, but they just laughed it off. It's probably ancient, Sarah said. Nobody's been here for years. I tried to push the worry out of my mind, but something about that sign bothered me. The first strange noise came not long after, a branch snapping in the distance, followed by a low rustling in the underbrush. We all paused, listening, but then David joked about it being a deer or something, and we went back to our conversation. But the noise didn't stop. Every so often, I would hear it again, quiet, almost like someone was deliberately trying not to be heard. My unease grew, but I didn't want to be the one to ruin the night by suggesting we leave. So I stayed quiet, pretending to enjoy myself, though my eyes kept darting around the dark forest. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond it was nothing but shadows. Then he appeared. Out of nowhere, a man stepped into the light. He was filthy, his clothes torn and stained, his hair wild. His eyes, though, were what scared me the most, cold and full of anger. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at us with a look that made my skin crawl. Finally he spoke, his voice rough and threatening. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "This is my land." We were all too shocked to respond right away. David, always the brave one, stood up and tried to explain that we didn't know it was private property, that we would leave in the morning. The man didn't seem to care. "You're on my land," he repeated, stepping closer. I could feel the tension rising, the air getting thicker. I wanted to leave right then, but it was already dark, and the thought of packing up and hiking back to the car in the pitch black was almost as terrifying as the man in front of us. Eventually he left, but not before making it clear that he expected us gone by sunrise. We sat in silence for a long time after that, the fun of the evening completely drained away. Nobody wanted to admit it, but we were scared. The forest around us, once peaceful, now felt like it was closing in. We should have left then. I knew it in my gut, but nobody wanted to move. So we stayed, huddled around the fire, trying to pretend everything was okay. But it wasn't. The noises came back, louder this time. Footsteps crunching leaves, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Sarah was the first to break. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. But David insisted we stay. "He's just trying to scare us," he said, though I could tell he didn't believe it himself. The footsteps got closer. We all heard them now, circling the campsite. Panic set in. We argued, the fear making us snap at each other. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but my legs felt like lead. Then he came back, and this time he wasn't alone. I couldn't see who else was with him, but I could feel their presence, hidden in the shadows just beyond the firelight. The man was holding something, a rifle, old and worn but still deadly. He pointed it at us, his face twisted with rage. "Leave now," he growled, "or you'll never leave at all." We scrambled to pack up, our hands shaking, dropping things in our rush. The man stood there, watching us, the gun never lowering. I could feel the others in the darkness, their eyes on us, waiting. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes before we were ready to go. We didn't bother with the tents, just grabbed our bags and ran. The man followed us to the edge of his land, his footsteps echoing in my ears the whole way. When we finally reached the car, I thought we were safe. But as we drove away, I looked back and saw him standing at the tree line, watching us with those cold eyes. And then I saw something else. Movement in the woods. Figures slipping back into the darkness. We didn't talk much on the way home. The silence was heavy, each of us lost in our thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, about the others I hadn't seen but had felt all around us. Who were they? What would have happened if we hadn't left? It wasn't until later that we learned the truth. The man was a wanted criminal, hiding out in those woods for years, evading capture. People had gone missing in that area, campers who had wandered too far off the trail. Their bodies were never found. We were lucky. We got away. But sometimes, late at night, I think about what could have happened, and I wonder if we really escaped. Because even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for the next group of campers to make the same mistake. The Vanishing Hiker. I don't know why I decided to go camping alone that weekend. Maybe I just needed to clear my head, to get away from everything and everyone. Life had been stressful lately, and the idea of spending a few days in the middle of nowhere with nothing but trees and birds around me sounded like the perfect escape. The drive to the campsite took longer than I expected. The forest seemed to swallow the road as I drove deeper into it. By the time I arrived, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the ground. I quickly set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire. The sound of the crackling fire was comforting, breaking the silence of the forest. The night was calm, almost too calm. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I sat by the fire, enjoying the peace and quiet. But as the night grew darker, I began to feel a strange sense of isolation. The trees around me seemed to close in, their dark shapes looming over me like silent watchers. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the effect of being alone in such a remote place. But the feeling didn't go away. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. The fire outside had died down to glowing embers, casting a faint red light on the canvas. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it. A voice. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. It was a woman's voice, calling for help. The sound was faint, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Help me. Please." I sat up, heart pounding. The voice was distant, almost like it was being carried by the wind from far away. I told myself it couldn't be real, that maybe I was just half asleep, my mind playing tricks on me. But then it came again, louder, more desperate. "Help. I'm lost." I couldn't just ignore it. What if someone was really out there, lost and in need of help? I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped out into the cold night air. The forest was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I shone the flashlight around, but all I could see were trees. The voice called out again, and I turned towards it, my heart racing. I couldn't just leave her out there. I had to help. I started walking, carefully picking my way through the underbrush. The voice guided me, calling out every few seconds. I followed it deeper into the woods, each step taking me further away from my campsite. The darkness was thick, the flashlight's beam barely cutting through it. After what felt like hours, I came upon a small clearing, My flashlight beam caught the edge of something, a tent. It was old and tattered, with a collapsed pole leaning to one side. The campfire in front of it was nothing but cold ashes. Scattered around were a few belongings: a torn backpack, a worn-out shoe, and an empty water bottle. But there was no sign of the woman. I called out, but the only answer was the rustling of leaves in the wind. The voice had stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Had I imagined the voice? Was this some kind of sick joke? I walked around the campsite, shining the flashlight over every inch, but there was nothing. No tracks, no signs of a struggle, nothing to suggest that anyone had been here recently. Just as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows, was a figure. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. It was just standing there, still and silent, watching me. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, like a shadow among the trees. Finally, I forced myself to lift the flashlight, to shine it on the figure. But as soon as the beam touched it, the figure vanished. There was nothing there, just empty space. I stumbled back, my heart racing. My flashlight flickered, and in that moment, I saw something on the ground where the figure had been. A single, worn-out shoe, identical to the one I had seen earlier in the abandoned campsite. Panic set in. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from that place. Branches scratched at my face and arms, roots tripped me up, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. When I finally burst back into my campsite, I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. But the moment I looked up, my blood ran cold. My tent was open. My belongings were scattered everywhere, as if someone had been rummaging through them. I stood up, my legs shaking, and slowly approached the tent. Then I heard it again, the voice. But this time, it was right behind me, so close that I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. "Help me, please." I spun around, but there was no one there. The flashlight flickered again, and in the weak light, I saw something move just beyond the trees. A shadow, slipping between the trunks, too fast for me to see clearly. I didn't wait. I grabbed what I could from the scattered mess, shoved it into my backpack, and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. The whole time, I could feel eyes on me, hear the faint sound of footsteps following me through the darkness. I don't know what happened that night, or who, or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back to that forest. And if you ever hear a voice calling for help in the middle of the night, don't follow it. You might not make it back. The unmarked path. My partner and I often go on hikes. It's our way of escaping the city and finding some peace in nature. We've done all the usual trails, but that day, we wanted something different. A new challenge. That's how we ended up on the unmarked path. We had heard about it from a friend of a friend, a trail hidden deep in the forest. No signs, no crowds, just pure wilderness. It sounded perfect, exactly what we needed. As we drove to the start of the trail, I felt excited, but also a bit uneasy. Maybe it was the thick, dark clouds rolling in, or maybe it was something else. But I pushed the feeling aside. I told myself it was just nerves. The beginning of the hike was beautiful, the forest alive with the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves. We walked in comfortable silence, only the crunch of our boots on the path breaking the quiet. But as we moved deeper into the woods, the atmosphere began to change. The trees grew closer together, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air felt heavier, and there was a strange smell, something sharp and metallic that I couldn't quite place. That's when we started noticing the signs. Fresh footprints in the dirt, much larger than ours. Broken branches hanging at odd angles, like someone had pushed through in a hurry. And then, the smell. It grew stronger, almost making me gag. It was the smell of blood. I stopped, looking at my partner. "Do you think we should turn back?" I asked, my voice shaky. "We've come this far," they replied, though I could see the doubt in their eyes. "Maybe it's just a hunter. We're probably close to some camp." Their words made sense, but something didn't feel right. Still, I nodded, and we continued forward, even though every instinct told me to turn around. My heart pounded in my chest as we followed the path, which was now barely visible under the thick undergrowth. Then we found it. The clearing. At first, it looked like just another open space in the forest, but as we walked closer, the horror of what we were seeing hit us. A piece of cloth, stained dark red, lay crumpled on the ground. Nearby, a broken phone, its screen shattered, was half buried in the dirt. There were marks in the earth, signs of a struggle. Someone had been here, and whatever happened, it wasn't good. "We need to leave," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. My partner nodded, their face pale, and we started to back away, trying not to make a sound. That's when we heard it, a rustling in the bushes behind us. We spun around, hearts racing, only to see an old man stepping out from the shadows. His clothes were dirty, and his face was rough, but he smiled like he was happy to see us. "You two lost?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge that made my skin crawl. "This isn't a good place to be wandering around." "We were just leaving," my partner said quickly, but the man shook his head. "You won't make it back before dark," he said, his eyes narrowing. "It's easy to get lost out here. Follow me. I'll take you to safety." Everything about him felt wrong. His smile was too wide, his eyes too cold. I didn't trust him, but fear and doubt clouded my judgment. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no idea how to get back. Maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe he was our only way out. My partner looked at me, uncertain, but I nodded. "Okay, we'll follow you," I said, hoping I wasn't making a terrible mistake. The man led us through the forest, taking a narrow, winding path that I was sure we hadn't seen before. As we walked, I noticed small things that set off alarms in my mind. He walked too quietly, his steps too deliberate. He never looked back at us, just kept moving forward with a strange determination. And the way he talked, it was like he knew too much, but was trying to hide it. "What happened in the clearing?" I finally asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you see anything?" The man didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was flat. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said. "Just a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding? The blood, the broken phone, the signs of a struggle. How could that be a misunderstanding? Panic started to rise in my chest. I looked at my partner, and I could see they were thinking the same thing. We needed to get away from this man. But we were lost, deep in the woods, with no idea where we were. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin, and we saw a cabin up ahead. It was old and run down, the windows covered with grime. "You'll be safe here," the man said, stopping in front of the door. Something in me snapped. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "We're not going in there." The man's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "You don't have a choice," he said, stepping closer. Before I could react, my partner grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Run!" they shouted, and we bolted into the trees, branches scratching our faces and tearing at our clothes. I didn't dare look back, my mind racing with fear. I could hear the man shouting behind us, but I couldn't make out the words. We ran until my lungs burned, until the forest around us became a blur. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, we realized we had no idea where we were. The forest was silent, the only sound our heavy breathing. "We can't stay here," I said, panic creeping into my voice. "We have to keep moving." But as we tried to figure out which way to go, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints on the ground, they were ours. We had been running in circles. That's when I heard it again, the rustling in the bushes. The man was close, too close. There was no time to think, no time to plan. I grabbed a large branch from the ground, my hands shaking. "I'm not going to let him take us," I whispered, more to myself than to my partner. The rustling grew louder and I tightened my grip on the branch, my heart pounding. But then the noise stopped. The forest was silent again, but the fear remained, growing stronger with each passing second. We never saw the man again, but I'll never forget that day. We eventually found our way back to the car, but the terror of those hours in the woods still haunts me. And sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the rustling of the bushes, still see the cold, hard smile of the man who led us to the edge of something far worse than fear. I needed some time away. Work was stressful, and life in the city felt too loud, too crowded. So I decided to go camping, alone, in a place where I could breathe. I found this spot online, a secluded campsite deep in the forest, far from anyone and anything. Perfect, I thought. I needed peace. When I arrived, the place was even quieter than I imagined. The trees were tall and thick, blocking out most of the sunlight. There were no other campers around, just me and nature. I should have felt at ease, but something about the silence made me uneasy. It was too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. I brushed off the feeling, thinking it was just the isolation messing with my mind. After all, I wasn't used to being alone like this. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and began to gather some firewood before it got too dark. That's when I saw it. A glint of light, like a tiny mirror catching the sun, came from somewhere in the trees. Curious, I walked closer, pushing through the thick underbrush until I found the source. It was a small black camera, hidden high up in a tree, camouflaged with leaves and branches. It was pointed directly at my campsite. My heart skipped a beat. Who would put a camera out here, and why was it watching my campsite? I climbed up a bit, stretching as far as I could until I managed to pull the camera down. It was still on, the small red light blinking at me. Someone had been watching me, maybe for hours. A cold sweat ran down my back. I scanned the trees, suddenly feeling like I wasn't alone. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow between the trees made me jump. I felt eyes on me, but I couldn't see anyone. My mind started racing. What if they were still here, watching me right now? The thought made my stomach churn. As night began to fall, my paranoia grew. The darkness felt heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. The fire I made seemed too small, too weak to keep anything or anyone away. I kept the camera close, unsure of what to do with it. My phone had no signal out here, so calling for help wasn't an option. I felt trapped, surrounded by trees and shadows, with no way to escape. I needed to know who was behind this. Maybe if I found something, it would make sense. I decided to search around the campsite, looking for any signs of someone else being here. After a while, I found them. Footprints, leading away from the campsite and disappearing into the forest. They weren't mine. They were fresh, and they were leading somewhere deeper into the woods. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever it was, they weren't far. I wanted to leave, to pack up and run, but I also needed to know what was going on. so I followed the footprints a short distance until they vanished into thick underbrush. The forest seemed to swallow them up, leaving no trace of where the person went. Fear twisted in my gut. What if they were still out there, watching me follow their trail? What if they were planning something? My mind filled with all kinds of horrible thoughts. I felt like prey, being hunted by something I couldn't see. Desperate, I returned to the camp and sat down by the fire, clutching the camera. I had to know what was on it. Maybe it would explain everything. I fumbled with it until I found the memory card and stuck it into my laptop. The screen lit up, showing dozens of video files. My hands shook as I clicked on the first one. The videos showed the campsite, but not just from today. There were clips from days, maybe weeks ago, showing different people setting up tents, cooking, laughing, all unaware they were being watched. My stomach turned as I realized how many people had been filmed without knowing. Then I found the file from today. The video showed me, from the moment I arrived. I watched myself set up the tent, gather firewood, find the camera. It felt surreal, like watching someone else. But the last clip made my blood run cold. It was me, sitting by the fire, just minutes ago. The camera was still on, still recording. But then, something shifted in the background. A shadow, moving closer, right behind me. I froze, staring at the screen. The shadow grew clearer until I could make out a person, standing just behind me, almost close enough to touch. I spun around, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. But there was nothing there. No one. The forest was dark and empty, just the fire crackling quietly in front of me. I looked back at the screen, but the video had ended. The last image was of me, looking terrified, with someone standing right behind me. My head spun with fear. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was someone really there, or was my mind playing tricks on me? The camera was still in my hand, the memory card now blank, as if it had never been recorded at all. I stood up, unsure of what to do. Run? Stay? My thoughts were a mess. But before I could decide, I heard a noise just behind me, a branch snapping, soft footsteps. My body went cold. I turned slowly, my breath caught in my throat, but I saw nothing. The darkness was complete, and the only light came from the dying fire. Then, as I was about to convince myself it was just an animal, I heard it again, closer this time. The story ends here. I don't know what happened next. Maybe I escaped. Maybe I didn't. But if you ever find a hidden camera in the woods, remember this story. Don't stay. Don't try to figure it out. Just run. I needed a break from everything. The noise, the people, the city. So I packed up my tent, some food, and drove far away from the busy streets. I wanted peace, just a few days to clear my mind. I found this remote camping spot, surrounded by a dense forest. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first day was calm, almost too calm. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. It felt good to be alone, away from everyone. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. As night fell, the silence became heavier. No wind, no animals, just a thick, quiet blanket over the forest. I felt a little uneasy, but I shrugged it off, convincing myself that this is what I came here for, peace and quiet. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I remember was a loud knock, like someone hitting the side of my tent. My eyes snapped open, heart racing, as I tried to process what had just happened. I told myself it was just a dream, but the echo of that knock still rang in my ears. I lay there, listening, straining to hear anything outside. Nothing. Just that thick, suffocating silence. After what felt like forever, I started to relax, telling myself it was probably just a branch falling or maybe an animal, but sleep wouldn't come. I was too on edge, my mind running through all the possibilities of what could be out there in the dark. Finally, I gathered the courage to check outside. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make a sound. The cold night air hit me as I stepped out, flashlight in hand. I swept the beam around the campsite, seeing nothing but shadows. My heart pounded in my chest, and just when I was about to go back inside, the light caught something. Footprints. Fresh footprints leading away from my tent, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. I froze. These were not animal tracks. They were human, and they were fresh. Panic set in. Someone had been outside my tent, close enough to touch it. Someone had been watching me while I slept. My mind raced with questions. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? Why would they knock on my tent and then just leave? My hands shook as I pointed the flashlight towards the path the footprints took, deep into the woods. I wanted to run back into my tent and pretend I never saw them, but something inside me wouldn't let it go. I had to know who or what was out there. So I started to follow the footprints, moving slowly, carefully. The trees loomed above me, blocking out the moonlight. Every snap of a twig under my feet made me jump, my heart hammering in my chest. The sense of being watched grew stronger with every step I took. It felt like eyes were on me from every direction, hiding in the shadows. The footprints were harder to see as I went deeper into the woods. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath, tapping it to stay on. The further I walked, the more I questioned my sanity. Strange noises started to fill the air, whispers, barely there, like the wind was trying to talk to me. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down I didn't believe it. Then, suddenly, the footprints vanished. The ground was rougher here, covered in leaves and branches, making it impossible to see where the person had gone. I turned in circles, scanning the area, but there was nothing. I was alone, lost in the dark, cold woods with no sign of who or what had been out there. I was ready to give up, to turn back and find my way to the tent, when I stumbled upon an old campsite. It looked abandoned, with torn, decayed tents and fire pits long cold. But something wasn't right. The place looked like it had been deserted for years, yet the footprints had led me here. Fear tightened around my chest like a vice. This wasn't a random encounter. I was being led, guided, maybe even hunted. I turned to leave, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there. But the moment I took a step back, the strange noises started again. Louder now, closer. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something that didn't want me to leave. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps as I ran back the way I came, following the dim beam of my flashlight. Every shadow seemed to move. Every tree seemed to reach out to grab me. I didn't care about the footprints anymore. I just wanted to get back to my tent, to pack up and drive away, never to return. When I finally reached my campsite, I stopped dead in my tracks. My tent was slashed open, the contents scattered across the ground. Someone had been here, right here while I was gone. My pulse raced as I noticed a new footprint, larger than before, just outside the torn entrance. Without thinking, I grabbed what I could and fled, not stopping until I was back in my car, speeding down the dark, winding road away from the forest. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. But even now, as I write this, the questions haunt me. Who knocked on my tent that night? And what would have happened if I hadn't woken up? I've always loved camping alone. There's something about being deep in the woods with nothing but the sounds of nature around you that makes me feel more alive. Away from the noise of the city, I can finally breathe, think, and just be. That's why I chose this spot, far from any trails or campsites. I wanted to be alone, or so I thought. It was late afternoon when I set up camp. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I had a small fire going, just enough to keep warm and cook a simple meal. The woods were quiet, only the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the silence. I checked my phone, barely one bar of signal. Good. I was off the grid, just like I wanted. As I sat by the fire, I heard it, a soft rustling in the bushes nearby. I froze, listening carefully. It could be anything, a deer, maybe a rabbit. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. And that's when I saw him. A boy, maybe 10 years old, stepped out from behind the bushes. He was small, with dirty clothes and messy hair. His face was pale and his eyes were wide with fear. He looked like he'd been through hell. "Please, help me," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm lost. I can't find my parents." I was shocked. What was a child doing out here, in the middle of nowhere? My first instinct was to help him. He looked so scared, so vulnerable. But something about the situation didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I forced a smile and tried to keep my voice calm. "It's okay," I said. "You're safe now. Do you know where your campsite is? Maybe we can find your parents together." The boy shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "I don't know," he whispered. "I got lost. I've been walking for hours." I felt a pang of sympathy, but that uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Why would a child be wandering alone in such a remote area? And why didn't he seem more upset, more frantic? Most kids would be crying their eyes out, but he was strangely calm, almost too calm. I decided to help him, but I stayed on guard. "All right," I said. "Let's see if we can find your campsite. It can't be too far from here." We started walking, the boy leading the way. As we moved deeper into the woods, the light began to fade. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches casting eerie shadows on the ground. The boy kept looking over his shoulder, like he was expecting someone to follow us. I asked him a few questions, where he was from, how long he'd been lost, but his answers were vague, almost rehearsed. The more we walked, the more uneasy I became. The woods were dense, and I realized we were heading in the opposite direction of my campsite. I had a decent sense of direction, and this path didn't feel right. "Are you sure this is the way?" I asked, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. The boy just nodded, not meeting my eyes. "It's not far," he said softly. "We're almost there." But something in his tone made my skin crawl. I wanted to turn back, but I didn't want to leave the boy alone. So I followed, though every step felt heavier, like I was walking into something I couldn't escape. Finally, we reached a clearing. The boy stopped, and I looked around, expecting to see tents or a campfire. But there was nothing, just trees and darkness. My heart started pounding as the realization hit me. We were far from my campsite, far from anywhere safe. I turned to the boy, my voice shaking. "Where is your campsite? Where are your parents?" The boy's expression changed. The fear was gone, replaced by something cold and unreadable. He stepped back, and I heard it. A faint sound, like whispering, coming from the trees. My blood ran cold as I saw shadows moving in the darkness, figures slowly emerging from the trees. It wasn't just the boy. There were others, hidden in the woods, watching us, waiting. I panicked. I turned and ran, but the forest felt different now. The trees seemed to twist and close in, blocking my path. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, making me stumble. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps fast and deliberate, getting closer with every second. I reached for my phone, desperate to call for help, but when I looked at the screen, the signal was gone. Nothing. No bars, no connection. I was completely cut off. My heart raced as I tried to find my way back to my campsite, but everything looked the same. I was lost, just like the boy had claimed to be. But now I knew it had been a lie, a trap. I could hear them getting closer, their whispers growing louder. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, hoping, praying that I could find my way out. But the forest seemed endless, and no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape. The last thing I remember is tripping, falling hard to the ground, and the cold touch of hands grabbing me, pulling me into the darkness. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I was alone. The boy, the figures, they were all gone. My campsite was nowhere to be found. I was lost, deep in the woods, with no way to call for help. That was 3 days ago. I've been walking ever since, trying to find my way out, but the woods never end. I'm tired, hungry, and I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching me, waiting. I don't know if anyone will ever find this, or if I'll ever get out. But if you're reading this, please, be careful in the woods. Not everything that looks lost wants to be found. I had never been a fan of hiking, but my friends convinced me that a weekend in the mountains would be a nice break from the city. I went along with it, even though the idea of being far from everything made me nervous. The first day was fine. We walked, talked, and took photos of the trees and rivers. But on the second day, things started to go wrong. The weather changed quickly. The clouds came out of nowhere, and soon it was raining heavily. My friends thought it was best to turn back, but I was sure I knew a shortcut. I didn't want to seem like I couldn't handle it, so I convinced them to follow me. But the rain made everything look different. The path I thought I knew disappeared, and soon we were lost. They were frustrated with me. As the rain turned into a storm, we decided to split up to find help. I knew it was a bad idea, but we were all tired and scared. We agreed to meet back at a marked tree in an hour, but I never made it back there. The storm got worse. The wind was strong, and the rain was so heavy I could barely see in front of me. I kept walking, hoping to find something, anything that could help. After what felt like hours, I saw a shape in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was an old cabin. Relief washed over me. I could finally get out of the storm. The cabin was small and looked like it hadn't been used in years. The windows were broken and the wood was rotting in places, but it was shelter. I pushed the door open and it creaked loudly, echoing in the silence of the storm. Inside, it was dark, but I could see enough to know that no one had lived there for a long time. I lit a match from the emergency kit in my bag and looked around. The cabin was simple, just one room with a small fireplace, a wooden table, and a few chairs. There were hunting trophies on the walls, dusty and old, but something was off. I couldn't tell what it was, but I felt uneasy, like I wasn't supposed to be there. As I moved around, the feeling got stronger. I saw a pile of blankets in the corner. When I pulled them back, I found food scraps, as if someone had been eating there recently. I looked closer and saw the fire was still warm. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Someone had been here, maybe not long ago. My first thought was that it was another lost hiker, but the more I looked, the less that made sense. On the table, I found a knife. The blade was stained with something dark, and there were bloodstains on the floor near it. Torn clothing was scattered around, some pieces caught on the rough edges of the wood. My heart started to race. I tried to tell myself it could have been an accident, but deep down I knew something bad had happened here. I started to feel like I was being watched. I didn't hear anything, but there was a sense, a pressure in the air, like someone else was in the room with me. I tried to calm myself down, but the silence was too loud, if that makes sense. I could hear every creak of the floor, every drop of water from the ceiling. The door suddenly closed behind me, and I almost screamed. It was just the wind, I told myself, but my hands were shaking. I decided to wait out the storm. I sat on one of the chairs facing the door, the knife on the table in front of me. The light from my match flickered, making shadows jump around the room. I kept hearing noises, small ones, like someone shifting their weight or breathing quietly. I kept turning my head, looking at the corners of the cabin, but there was nothing there. At some point, the storm outside grew louder. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and I felt the cabin shake. I was trapped in this place, with no way out until the storm passed. My thoughts kept circling back to the bloody knife and the clothes. Who did they belong to? What happened to them? And most importantly, was whoever did this still here? I didn't want to think about it, but the cabin seemed to close in around me. My breathing became shallow, and I started to sweat. I felt like I was losing my mind. I had to get out, but the storm was too strong. I wouldn't survive out there, not in the dark, not with the wind pushing me down at every step. My only choice was to stay. Then I heard it, footsteps, soft but unmistakable, coming from behind me. I froze, every muscle tense. The steps stopped, but I didn't dare to turn around. I could feel someone standing there, right behind me, just out of sight. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. Suddenly, something touched my shoulder. It was light, barely a tap, but it was enough. I grabbed the knife and turned around in one motion, slashing at the air. There was nothing there. I was alone, but the fear didn't go away. I was sure that someone had been there, right behind me. I couldn't stay another second. I grabbed my bag and ran out into the storm. The wind hit me hard, almost knocking me over, but I didn't stop. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away from that cabin, from whatever was in there with me. I don't know how long I ran. The rain blurred everything, and I stumbled more than once, but I didn't stop. When I finally saw lights in the distance, I nearly cried. It was a road, and a car was coming. I waved my arms, shouting, and the car slowed down. The driver looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I climbed in, soaked and shivering, and told him to drive. I didn't tell the driver what happened. I didn't even know how to explain it. But when I looked back, I could still see the cabin through the trees, dark and silent. Even now, I can't stop thinking about it. I don't know who was in there or what they wanted, but I know one thing. I was not alone in that cabin. I always loved hiking. There's something about the quiet of the woods, the fresh air, and being far away from the noise of the city that makes me feel alive. So, when my friends suggested we go on a weekend hike in a remote area, I was all for it. We had done this kind of thing before, and it was always fun. But this time, something felt different, though I couldn't put my finger on it. We started early in the morning, the sun just rising as we parked our cars and began the trek into the forest. There were 5 of us, me, Mike, Jen, Tom, and Alice. We joked around, talking about work and plans for the weekend, just like usual. The trail was easy at first, and we made good time. But as we got deeper into the woods, the atmosphere changed. It was too quiet. No birds singing, no rustling in the bushes, just silence. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. By midday, we were deep in the forest, far from any signs of civilization. We stopped for a break, sitting on some rocks and pulling out snacks from our backpacks. That's when we noticed Alice wasn't there. "Where's Alice?" Mike asked, looking around. We all stopped, realizing she wasn't with us. It didn't make sense. She was just with us a minute ago. We called out her name, our voices echoing through the trees, but there was no answer. Panic started to creep in as we searched the area, thinking she might have wandered off to use the bathroom or take a picture, but there was no sign of her. After an hour of searching, we were all on edge. Mike suggested we split up to cover more ground. I wasn't sure it was a good idea, but we were desperate. Mike and Tom went one way, while Jen and I took another. We agreed to meet back in 30 minutes. As Jen and I walked through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Every crack of a twig made me jump, and the silence felt like it was pressing down on us. Then I saw it, Alice's backpack, lying on the ground a few feet ahead. I ran over to it, calling out her name, but again, nothing. The backpack was open, its contents scattered across the forest floor, a water bottle, some snacks, and a single shoe. My heart sank. Something was wrong, very wrong. "Jen, look at this," I said, my voice shaking as I showed her what I found. She paled, fear in her eyes. We both knew this wasn't just a simple case of someone getting lost. We kept moving, my mind racing with horrible thoughts. What if she had been attacked by an animal? What if someone had taken her? I tried to stay calm, but the fear was getting harder to ignore. Then we came across a small clearing, and I knew something bad had happened there. The ground was disturbed, leaves and dirt kicked up as if there had been a struggle. Branches were broken, hanging limply from trees, and there were marks on the ground that looked like someone had been dragged. My stomach turned as I realized what I was seeing, but there was no blood, no sign of where Alice had gone. Just the terrifying evidence that she had been here, and now she was gone. Then I heard it. A faint rustling noise coming from the trees behind us. I spun around, my heart pounding, but I couldn't see anything. Jen grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to go back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Now." We ran back to the meeting point, every snap of a branch making me think we were being followed. When we got there, Mike and Tom were already waiting, their faces pale. They hadn't found anything, and when I showed them Alice's belongings, the fear on their faces mirrored my own. "We have to keep looking," Tom said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. We argued, the stress and fear making us all snappy, but in the end, we decided to leave and get help. It felt like giving up, like we were abandoning her, but we didn't know what else to do. The hike back to the trailhead was the longest walk of my life. Every step felt like it took an eternity, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, someone, following us. But there was nothing. Just the empty, silent forest. When we finally reached the cars, we were all exhausted, both physically and mentally. No one spoke as we loaded up our gear and drove to the nearest town to report Alice's disappearance. The police organized a search party, and we went back with them, but they didn't find anything. It was like Alice had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the haunting memory of that day. Weeks later, I still can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see that clearing, the disturbed ground, the broken branches. I hear the rustling in the trees and feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The woods that I once loved now fill me with dread. I don't think I'll ever go hiking again. Not after what happened. Not after Alice disappeared. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if we were followed out of those woods. If whatever or whoever took Alice is still out there, waiting. I'll never know for sure, and that's the scariest part. My wife and I thought a weekend by the river would be a perfect escape. We needed a break from the city, from work, from everything. The idea of a quiet camping trip in the middle of nowhere sounded like a dream. We drove out to a remote spot by the river, a place we found online that promised peace and isolation. The drive took hours, but as soon as we arrived, it felt worth it. The riverbank was quiet. The only sounds were the soft flow of water and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was just us and nature. We set up our tent quickly. The sun was still high and the day was warm. My wife and I sat by the river just listening to the water. There was no one around, no other campers, nothing to disturb us. We were completely alone, or so we thought. As the sun began to dip in the sky, I noticed something strange. Across the river on the opposite bank, a group of people stood watching us. They were just standing there, maybe 5 or 6 of them, not moving, not saying anything, just watching. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just curious, or maybe they were other campers who happened to be in the same area. But something about the way they stood, so still, gave me a bad feeling. My wife noticed them too, and I could see the unease in her eyes. I waved at them, trying to be friendly, but they didn't wave back. They didn't even move. We tried to ignore them, thinking they would go away or at least move on, but they didn't. They just stayed there, like statues, watching us as the sun set. The longer they stood there, the more uneasy we became. My wife suggested we pack up and leave, but it was getting dark and I didn't want to drive back through the woods at night. I told her we should wait, maybe they'd leave on their own. But they didn't leave. As night fell, we could see them more clearly in the moonlight. They had started a fire on their side of the river, but they still didn't speak or come any closer. We were both on edge now, the silence and their presence making it impossible to relax. We whispered to each other, trying to figure out what to do. My wife was scared, and to be honest, so was I. The strangers across the river were more than just unsettling. They were terrifying in their silence, their stillness. It felt like they were waiting for something, but we didn't know what. The fire they started on their side of the river cast long shadows, making their faces impossible to see. The more I thought about it, the more I realized we were trapped. We were miles from anywhere, and there was no one to help us if something went wrong. My wife insisted we leave, but I told her it would be safer to wait until morning. I didn't want to admit I was scared to move, scared of what might happen if we tried to leave in the dark. Then, in the middle of the night, we heard it. Splashing. Footsteps. The strangers were crossing the river. My heart raced as I realized they were coming for us. I grabbed my wife's hand and we both scrambled to pack up our things, but it was too late. The strangers were already too close. I could see them in the moonlight, their faces still hidden. But I saw something else too, a glint of metal. One of them had a knife. Panic set in. We couldn't stay, but running felt just as dangerous. My wife was shaking, and I was trying to think, trying to find a way out. We grabbed our flashlight and ran. We didn't take anything else, just the flashlight and each other. We ran into the woods, away from the river, away from the strangers. The only sound was our heavy breathing and the crunch of leaves under our feet. I didn't know if they were following us, but I didn't dare look back. The woods were dark, and the flashlight barely lit the way. We stumbled through the trees, tripping over roots, crashing through bushes. The fear of being caught kept us going, but we didn't know where we were going. We just ran. My wife kept asking if we were safe, if we had lost them, but I didn't know. I couldn't tell if we were being chased or if the strangers had stayed by the river. All I knew was that we had to keep moving. After what felt like hours, we stopped. We were lost, deep in the forest, with no idea how far we had gone. The flashlight was dying, the beam growing weaker by the minute. We were exhausted, scared, and completely disoriented. My wife clung to me, and I held her close, trying to reassure her, trying to reassure myself. But then, in the distance, I heard something. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, getting closer. I turned off the flashlight, and we stood in the dark, holding our breath, listening. The footsteps were coming from the direction we had come from, and they were getting closer. We weren't alone in the woods. We had no choice but to run again, deeper into the darkness, away from the footsteps, away from whatever was following us. We didn't know if we were running in circles or if we were heading deeper into the wilderness. All we knew was that we had to keep moving. The footsteps followed us, never far behind, always getting closer. And that's where we are now, lost in the woods, running from something we can't see, something we don't understand. I don't know if we'll make it out of here. I don't know if we're being hunted or if we're just running from shadows. But I do know one thing. We're not alone. And whatever is out there, it's not friendly. I just hope we can keep running long enough to find a way out. But with every step, I'm losing hope. I've been into radio stuff for years. It's a simple hobby, really. Most people today wouldn't find it exciting, but for me, it's always been like a little window to the unknown. You never know what you might hear. A random conversation, weather reports, sometimes even something stranger. But nothing prepared me for what I heard last week. It was getting late, and I was flipping through frequencies when I caught something odd. At first, it was just a faint crackle, like static. But then I heard it. SOS. SOS. It was barely audible, but it was clear enough to get my attention. It didn't make sense. I was miles away from the nearest town, and there weren't any big roads or houses near where I live. Who could be sending a distress signal out here? My first thought was that it might be some kind of prank, but the signal kept going, weak but steady. Something inside me said I needed to check it out. Maybe someone really was in trouble, lost in the woods or something. The sun was setting, but I didn't care. I packed a small bag, just the essentials, and headed out, trying to follow the signal. The woods around my place are thick and dark, especially at night. I've lived here for years, so I know them pretty well, but they still have a way of making you feel small and vulnerable. As I walked deeper into the trees, the signal got a bit stronger, guiding me like a beacon. I can't say why, but I started to feel uneasy, like I was doing something wrong by following it. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. After what felt like hours, I finally reached a small clearing, and there it was, a campsite. But something was wrong. The place was deserted, but it didn't look like it had been abandoned peacefully. The tent was half collapsed, and there were dark stains on the fabric. My breath caught in my throat when I realized it was blood. The silence was overwhelming. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just me and that tent. I forced myself to move closer, telling myself I needed to see if anyone was inside. The air was heavy, like it was pressing down on me, but I unzipped the tent anyway. Inside, it was a mess. Clothes were ripped and thrown everywhere, and there were more stains on the ground. It looked like there had been a fight, but there was no one here now. My hands were shaking as I searched through the scattered belongings, and that's when I found the notebook. It was a small, battered thing, pages filled with rushed handwriting. I could barely make out the words, but what I could read sent chills down my spine. Whoever wrote it was scared, really scared. The last few entries talked about being followed, about hearing footsteps at night. The last page ended with, "He's close. I can feel him watching." My heart was pounding. Who was he? And where was the person who wrote this? Suddenly, the radio signal that had been steady this whole time cut off. Dead silence. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. I decided right then that I needed to get out of there. I wasn't prepared for this. But just as I was turning to leave, I heard it. Footsteps, soft and slow, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, my mind racing. Maybe it was the person who sent the signal, I thought. Maybe they were injured, trying to make their way back. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response, just the sound of someone or something moving closer. Panic gripped me. I didn't want to stay another minute, but the idea of running through the dark forest was just as terrifying. So I did the only thing that made sense. I crawled into the tent and zipped it up. I knew it was a stupid move, but my brain wasn't working right. I just wanted to hide. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I held my breath, clutching a metal rod I found inside as a weapon. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. And then the shadow appeared. It was just outside the thin fabric of the tent, standing there, unmoving. I could see the outline of a person, tall and thin, but I couldn't make out any details. For what felt like an eternity, we were both frozen like that, me inside, and whatever it was outside. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the shadow was gone. The footsteps moved away, getting fainter until there was only silence again. I stayed in the tent until the first light of dawn began to creep through the fabric. When I finally dared to unzip it, there were new footprints in the dirt, leading away from the campsite. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. Whoever or whatever it was, they were gone. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed the notebook and hiked back to town as fast as I could. My mind was a blur, trying to make sense of what happened. When I got back, I went straight to the authorities. I told them everything. They listened, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They searched the woods but found nothing. No blood, no tent, no footprints. It was like the campsite never existed. The only proof I had was the notebook, but when they looked at it, the pages were blank. I swear I saw the writing, but it was gone. They treated me like I was crazy, and maybe I was starting to believe them. Now I'm back home, trying to forget. But last night, as I was messing with my radio, I heard it again. The same SOS signal, just as faint as before. I turned off the radio and haven't touched it since. Whatever is out there, I don't want to find out. Not again. I needed some time alone. Life had been too loud, too much, and I couldn't think straight anymore. So, I decided to go camping by myself in a forest far from everything and everyone. I found a spot online, a place where I could disappear for a few days. No phones, no people, just me and the trees. It seemed perfect. When I arrived, the forest was even more beautiful than I had imagined. The trees were tall, their leaves whispering softly in the wind. The sunlight filtered through in patches, creating a warm, welcoming glow. I felt a bit of the tension leave my body as I set up my tent and got ready to enjoy the silence. I was excited, even a little relieved, to be alone for a while. But there was something about the place that made me uneasy. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I felt like someone was watching me. I shook it off, thinking it was just nerves from being alone in an unfamiliar place. After all, I'd never done anything like this before, and it was natural to feel a bit anxious, right? The first night was mostly quiet. I heard the usual sounds you'd expect in a forest: leaves rustling, animals moving through the underbrush, the distant call of an owl. But then, sometime after midnight, I woke up to a noise outside my tent. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to snap me out of sleep. It sounded like footsteps, but not heavy ones. Maybe an animal, I thought, though it seemed strange. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest playing tricks on me, and eventually, I fell back asleep. In the morning, I found something strange near my tent. A cigarette butt. I don't smoke, and there was no one else around. I picked it up, confused, and looked around. Maybe someone had camped here before me and left it behind. That made sense, right? Still, it didn't sit well with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was fresh, like it had been left there recently. The day passed uneventfully, and I tried to forget about the cigarette. But as night fell again, the uneasy feeling returned. I sat by the campfire, staring into the flames, feeling like I wasn't alone. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. It was like the trees were holding their breath, waiting. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer, more deliberate. I lay in my tent, every muscle tense, listening as the soft crunch of leaves moved around my campsite. My heart pounded in my chest, and I was too scared to even move. The steps stopped, then started again, circling my tent. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was just an animal. When I woke up in the morning, there was another item near my tent. A small toy, an action figure. It was dirty, covered in mud, and looked old. But what was it doing here? I hadn't seen any other campers, and this definitely wasn't something that would just be lying around in the woods. My stomach churned as I stared at it, feeling more scared than I wanted to admit. I was tempted to leave, but I didn't want to give in to fear. Maybe it was just some kids messing around, I told myself, trying to calm down. Or maybe I was overthinking things. I decided to stay, determined not to let a few strange noises and items ruin my trip. But each night, it got worse. More items appeared. Arranged stones, a piece of clothing that wasn't mine, things that didn't belong. The footsteps became more frequent, more insistent. They didn't just circle my tent now. They lingered, like someone was standing just outside, watching, waiting. I was barely sleeping, my nerves frayed, and the idea of being alone in this forest started to feel like a terrible mistake. On the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. When I heard the footsteps again, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside the tent, my hands shaking. The light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. But then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, fresh and clear. They weren't mine. They were too big, too deep. Someone had been here, right next to my tent, watching me. My heart raced as I followed the prints, my fear growing with each step. They led me to a small clearing not far from my campsite. In the middle of the clearing, I found something that made my blood run cold. A pile of cigarette butts, toys, and other items, all the things that had been left around my tent. And there, in the middle of it all, was a small hidden camera pointed directly at where I'd been sleeping. Panic surged through me. This wasn't just someone messing around. Someone had been watching me, stalking me. I felt sick, like the ground was falling away beneath me. I turned and ran back to my campsite, my mind racing. I had to get out of there now. I packed up as fast as I could, my hands trembling, every sound making me jump. As I shoved everything into my backpack, I heard it again, the footsteps. They were closer, faster, like whoever was out there knew I was leaving and didn't want me to go. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran to my car, the sounds of the forest chasing me, the feeling of being watched burning into my back. I fumbled with the keys, almost dropping them in my haste. Finally, I got the door open, threw my stuff inside, and started the engine. As I sped down the dirt road, leaving the forest behind, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. Every time I close my eyes, I see that figure in the mirror, and I wonder if I really left them behind in the forest, or if they followed me home. I've always loved camping, being out in nature, away from everything. It's where I find peace. But this trip, it was different. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just me, my tent, and the forest. I found this campsite marked on an old map I had, far off the beaten path. I thought it'd be perfect, a place where no one would bother me. I didn't know it was a place no one dared to go. The drive took longer than I expected. The road was narrow, winding through dense woods that grew darker the further I went. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was already dipping below the trees. The campsite looked forgotten, like it hadn't seen a visitor in years. The grass was tall, almost hiding the remnants of an old fire pit. There were no signs of recent activity, but that didn't bother me. I thought I was lucky to have found such a secluded spot. I set up my tent quickly, not wanting to waste daylight. As I worked, I started noticing things that didn't sit right with me. Near the edge of the campsite, something shiny caught my eye. I walked over and found an old rusted tin can half buried in the dirt. Nearby, there was a faded piece of cloth, maybe part of a shirt or a blanket. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten like everything else around here. I shook off the weird feeling creeping up on me, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. But then, I found something that I couldn't ignore. A piece of a tent, torn and dirty, lying in the bushes. It looked like it had been ripped apart by something, or someone. I stood there, holding the dirty fabric in my hands, feeling the unease growing inside me. But I forced myself to shrug it off. I told myself that it was probably just an old campsite that had seen better days, maybe from a storm or careless campers. As night fell, the forest grew silent, too silent. Normally, you'd hear crickets or the rustling of leaves, but there was nothing. Just a heavy, suffocating quiet that made my skin crawl. I tried to distract myself by cooking dinner over the fire, but my mind kept drifting back to that torn tent and the abandoned feel of the place. It didn't help that the shadows seemed to move whenever I looked away, as if the trees themselves were watching me. When I finally crawled into my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something, footsteps, just outside the tent. They were light at first, like someone trying not to be heard. I held my breath, straining to listen, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Then the footsteps grew louder, closer, circling the tent. I felt paralyzed, too scared to move or even breathe. I kept telling myself to calm down, that it was nothing, but the sounds kept coming. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, as whatever it was moved around outside. I wanted to look, to see what was out there, but I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent. I was too scared of what I might see. Lying there, I suddenly remembered a news article I'd read a while back about hikers who had gone missing in this area. They were never found. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, but now the memory hit me like a punch to the gut. What if this was where they went missing? What if this was the place people didn't return from? Panic started to set in. I felt trapped, like the tent was a prison, and outside was something waiting to get me. The noises outside stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe it was over. Maybe whatever it was had gone away. But then I heard it again, breathing, heavy, and close. I could hear it right outside the thin layer of fabric separating me from whatever was out there. And then, whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there, low and menacing. I knew I had to get out of there, but my body wouldn't listen. I was frozen in fear, unable to move. Finally, I forced myself to unzip the tent just a tiny bit and peek outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were shadows moving in the darkness, but they weren't just shadows. They were people, or at least they looked like people, but their movements were wrong, too slow and deliberate, like they were stalking something, stalking me. I knew I had to leave, but every muscle in my body was screaming at me to stay put, to hide. I started packing up my things as quietly as I could, all the while keeping an eye on the figures moving closer. But I wasn't quiet enough. They heard me. The shadows stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then they started moving faster, closing in on the tent. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted through the trees, branches whipping at my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet. I didn't dare look back. All I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart, but I knew they were behind me. I could feel them getting closer. I don't know how I made it back to my car, but when I did, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I jumped in, slammed the door, and sped away, not caring if I was on the road or not. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. When I finally did, I was shaking so hard I couldn't keep my hands on the wheel. I didn't sleep that night or the next. When I finally went to the police, they didn't take me seriously. They said there was no campsite where I'd been, that the area had been closed off for years after too many people went missing. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, waiting. I don't know if I'll ever go camping again. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. All I know is that I got away, but I don't think I escaped. We were four friends who had known each other since childhood. We grew up together in the same small town, and every summer we would go camping in the woods near our hometown. This year, we chose a new spot, far deeper into the forest than we had ever gone before. We wanted an adventure, something more exciting than the usual, but we didn't know that we were stepping into something we couldn't control. The first day was great. We found a clearing, set up our tents, and started a fire as the sun dipped below the trees. The quiet was different here, thicker somehow, with no distant hum of roads or towns, just the rustling of leaves and the crackling of the fire. We sat around it, talking and laughing, feeling like we were the only people in the world. That's when he appeared. I noticed him first, a shadow moving between the trees. He stepped into the light of our fire, and we all went silent. He was a young man, maybe in his late 20s, with a scruffy beard and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked tired, and his clothes were dirty, like he had been walking for a long time. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice soft and calm. "I got lost and saw your fire. Mind if I stay the night?" There was something off about him, but it wasn't something I could explain. Just a feeling, like a small knot in my stomach. Still, it didn't feel right to turn him away. We were miles from anywhere, and the sun had already set. "Sure," I said, and the others nodded. "You can stay." He sat down with us, and we tried to keep the conversation going, but it wasn't the same. His presence changed the mood, made it harder to laugh or relax. He didn't say much, only answering our questions with short, vague answers. He said his name was Paul, and he had been hiking alone. He didn't say why, and we didn't ask. Something in his eyes told us not to. As the night went on, the fire died down, and the air grew colder. We decided to turn in, each of us crawling into our tents, with Paul settling down a little away from us. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the night. The woods were usually full of noise, crickets, owls, the rustling of animals, but tonight it was almost silent. Just the faint crackling of the dying fire and the occasional snap of a twig. I don't know how long I had been lying there, half asleep, when I heard it. A soft rustling sound, like someone was moving outside. I sat up, my heart pounding. I listened, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, but the sound continued, too controlled, too deliberate. I unzipped my tent and peered out. The fire was almost out, casting just enough light to see the dark shapes of the tents and the trees beyond. And then I saw him, Paul, walking silently around the campsite. He moved so quietly, like he was gliding over the ground. He stopped at each tent, crouching down, like he was listening or watching. I wanted to call out, to wake the others, but something stopped me. Fear, maybe. I wasn't sure if I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the shadows making things look stranger than they were. But then he turned and looked directly at me. I froze. His eyes locked onto mine, and I could see something in them, something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't anger or anything like that. It was a kind of cold curiosity, like he was trying to decide what to do with me. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but then he turned away, moving back to where he had been lying down. I lay back down, heart racing, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I lay there, listening, waiting for something to happen. But the night stretched on, and nothing did. When the morning came, the tension from the night before seemed to vanish in the light of day. The others acted like nothing had happened. Maybe they hadn't noticed. Paul was still there, eating breakfast with us, acting like he was just another camper. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later that day, I realized my knife was missing. It wasn't much, just a small pocket knife, but I always kept it in my bag. I asked the others, but no one had seen it. A little while later, one of the others mentioned that their flashlight was gone too. We all started checking our things, and sure enough, more items were missing. Small things, but important when you're out in the middle of nowhere. That night, as we sat around the fire, the tension was back, thicker than before. We were all on edge, casting glances at Paul, who sat quietly by the fire, staring into the flames. It was like he was waiting for something, and the unease was growing, spreading through the group. Finally, one of us spoke up, asking him directly about the missing items. Paul didn't respond right away. He just looked up at us, his face unreadable. Then, with a slow smile, he said he didn't know what we were talking about. But there was something in his voice, something that made my blood run cold. One of the guys stood up, saying he wanted to check Paul's backpack. Paul's smile faded, and his eyes darkened. He stood up too, facing us, and for the first time, I saw how much bigger he was than any of us. The silence was heavy, pressing down on us, and I realized that we were all scared, really scared. But before anything could happen, Paul turned and ran. He grabbed his backpack and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. We were left standing there, stunned and shaken. Panic set in. We knew we couldn't stay there, not with him out there somewhere, watching us. We packed up quickly, barely speaking, and started back towards the trail, but it was dark and the forest was thick. We didn't get far before we heard it. The sound of footsteps, fast and heavy, coming from behind us. We ran, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces. The footsteps followed, closer and closer. I could hear my own breath, ragged and desperate, and the pounding of my heart. I didn't know if the others were still with me, didn't dare to look back. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The forest was silent again, but the silence was worse than the noise. I slowed down, panting, trying to listen, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. I don't know how long I kept running, but eventually I tripped and fell, too exhausted to get back up. I lay there, trembling, waiting for the end, but nothing came. When I finally got the courage to move, I found myself alone. surrounded by darkness. There was no sign of the others, no sound of pursuit, just me, lost in the forest, with no way to know if I was truly alone or if he was still out there, waiting. I never saw my friends again. We were supposed to be out there just for the weekend, 3 days away from the noise of the city, camping deep in the wilderness. It was me, Jordan, Claire, and Mike. We'd all known each other for years, so when Mike suggested the trip, it sounded like a great idea. I'd been looking forward to the quiet, the peace that comes with being surrounded by trees and nothing else. But, of course, that's not how things turned out. It was on the second night that we saw the flare. We'd set up our tents near a small clearing, and after dinner, we were sitting around the fire, talking about nothing important. The stars were out, and the air was cool, the kind of night that makes you feel small in a good way. Then, out of nowhere, a bright red light shot up into the sky, far off in the distance. It wasn't one of those flares you see in movies, drifting slowly down. This one was sharp, fast, and then it was gone. Jordan noticed it first. "Did you guys see that?" he asked, standing up and squinting into the dark. We all looked, but by then, the light was gone. "Probably someone in trouble," Claire said, her voice steady but a little concerned. Mike nodded, his face serious. I didn't say anything, but I felt uneasy. That flare meant someone needed help, right? We couldn't just ignore it. "We should check it out," Mike said, already grabbing his flashlight. The idea of going into the woods at night didn't thrill me, but Mike was right. We couldn't just stay by the fire and pretend we didn't see it. The walk was longer than I expected. The light had looked close, but distances can be tricky in the woods. We followed the direction where we thought the flare had come from, flashlights sweeping through the trees. The darkness seemed thicker the further we went, and the sounds of the forest felt louder, more intrusive. Finally, we saw it. A small makeshift camp. A fire was still burning, but just barely. The campsite looked like it had been put together quickly, like whoever set it up wasn't planning to stay long. There were a couple of tents, a backpack half zipped open, some scattered clothes, but no people. "Where is everyone?" Claire asked, her voice breaking the silence. Nobody answered. There was something off about the place. It wasn't just that the camp was empty. It was the way things were left. Like the people who'd been there had left in a hurry. Or maybe they didn't leave by choice. We started looking around, trying to figure out what had happened. Jordan checked the tents. They were empty, but not in a tidy way. One of them had a sleeping bag that was half out, like someone had been in it and then dragged out. That's when I noticed the blood. Just a few drops near the edge of the campfire. I crouched down, staring at the dark stains on the dirt, fresh enough to still look red. "Guys, come look at this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The others gathered around and we all stared at the blood in silence. "We need to leave," Claire said, her voice urgent. "We need to get out of here and call someone." But Mike wasn't ready to go. "We can't just leave them if they're hurt. We have to look for them." He was right, and that's what scared me. We started searching the area, and that's when we found more signs that something terrible had happened. A torn piece of fabric caught on a bush, deep scratches on the ground like someone had been dragged, and fresh footprints leading away from the camp. Everything in me wanted to turn around and run, but Mike was already following the footprints. "We have to find them," he kept saying, his voice tense. Jordan and Claire looked at me, but what could I say? We were already too deep into this. We followed the footprints, deeper into the woods. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before we found it. A mound of dirt, not even completely covered. There was something sticking out, a piece of a jacket maybe? Mike went to it, started digging with his hands, and then he froze. "Help me," he said, his voice shaking. We all joined him, pulling the dirt away, and then we saw it. A body, partly buried. The face was pale, dirt sticking to the skin. I didn't recognize him, but that didn't matter. Whoever he was dead, and not for long. Panic hit me like a wave, making it hard to breathe. We had to get out of there. "We need to go," I said, but it came out as a whisper. Then I heard it, a rustling in the bushes. I turned, and for a moment, I thought I saw someone standing there, just at the edge of my flashlight's reach, watching us. I wasn't the only one who saw it. Claire gasped, and before I knew it, we were all running. I didn't know where to, just away from that horrible place. The forest was alive with sounds, footsteps that weren't ours, branches snapping behind us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Jordan tripped, falling hard, but Mike grabbed him, pulling him back up. We didn't stop, couldn't stop. The footsteps were getting closer, and all I could think was that we weren't going to make it. I could feel something, someone, right behind us, just out of sight. When we finally broke through the trees and saw our campsite, relief flooded through me. But it didn't last. Our tents were slashed open, our bags torn apart. Everything we had brought was scattered and ruined. We were stranded, no way to call for help, nothing to defend ourselves with. And then I heard it. Another flare. This time, it was closer. Much closer. I looked at my friends, their faces pale with fear, and I knew we weren't alone. Whoever had been at that camp, whoever had done all this, they were coming for us, and there was nothing we could do to stop them. I went into the woods to get away from everything. The city, the noise, the people, it all became too much. So I packed my bag and headed out to a place far from civilization where I could be alone, where nobody could bother me. The forest was supposed to be peaceful, a retreat where I could think, maybe even find some clarity. But peace was the last thing I found. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I set up my tent near a small stream, the sound of water flowing over rocks calming my nerves. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves or distant calls of birds. It was easy to pretend that I was the only person for miles around, and that was what I wanted. But there were signs, small things I ignored at first. Twigs snapped more often than they should have, and sometimes I felt like I was being watched. I dismissed it as paranoia. After all, who else would be out here? It was probably just animals, I told myself. Maybe deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in the pit of my stomach. One night, everything changed. It was late, probably close to midnight when I heard it. Voices, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the more I listened, the clearer they became. I peeked out of my tent and saw faint lights flickering through the trees, like flashlights. Who would be out here at this hour? My curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed my flashlight and, keeping it off, crept toward the voices. I moved slowly, careful not to make any noise. The voices grew louder as I got closer, and I could start to make out what they were saying. It wasn't friendly. They were arguing, hissing at each other in low, urgent tones. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I had to remind myself to breathe. I crouched behind a bush, peering through the leaves, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There were 3 of them, rough-looking men, and they were standing around a large hole in the ground. One of them was holding a shovel. The other 2 were dragging something, a body. I couldn't see the face, but the shape was unmistakable. They were burying a body. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I knew I had to get out of there, but as I started to back away, my foot landed on a dry branch. The sharp crack seemed to echo through the entire forest, and all three men snapped their heads in my direction. For a second, nobody moved. Then one of them shouted and they all started running toward me. Panic took over. I turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush as fast as I could. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I could hear them behind me, their heavy footsteps and the rustling of leaves as they tore through the forest. They were shouting, but I couldn't make out the words. It didn't matter. All that mattered was getting away. The forest that had seemed so calm and safe now felt like a trap. The trees were too close together, the ground uneven and covered in roots and rocks that threatened to trip me with every step. I could hear them getting closer, and I pushed myself harder, lungs burning, legs screaming in pain. I wasn't thinking anymore, just running on pure instinct, desperate to escape. I stumbled into a small clearing, and my heart sank when I saw what was ahead, a steep drop. There was no time to think. I could hear the men crashing through the trees behind me, so I did the only thing I could. I jumped. The fall wasn't long, but it was enough. I hit the ground hard, pain exploding through my leg as I landed. I couldn't hold back a scream as I felt something snap. The pain was blinding, but I forced myself to stay quiet, listening for the men. They had reached the edge of the drop, their flashlights sweeping the ground, but they didn't see me. After a few minutes, they moved on, cursing under their breath. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then dragged myself into a small cave nearby. The pain in my leg was unbearable, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, had to get out of there. I huddled in the cave, shaking from both the cold and the fear, praying they wouldn't find me. I must have passed out because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. The pain in my leg was still there, a constant throbbing reminder of how close I had come to being caught. I knew I had to get back to my campsite, get my things, and leave before they found me. The walk back was a nightmare. Every step sent a jolt of pain through my body, but I didn't have a choice. I had to keep going. When I finally reached my campsite, I found it in shambles. My tent was slashed open, my belongings scattered and torn. They had been here. They had found my camp. I grabbed what I could and started limping back toward civilization. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like one of them. I felt like they were still watching me, waiting for the right moment to finish what they started. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces, hear their voices. I don't know if they'll come for me, but I can't stop thinking about it. The worst part is, I know they saw me, and they know I saw them. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. I've never been one to go camping alone, but this time, I needed to clear my head. The campsite was supposed to be peaceful, quiet, far away from everything. When I got there, it was exactly what I wanted. No other tents, no people, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the rustle of leaves. Perfect, or so I thought. As I set up my tent, I noticed something odd. Half buried under a pile of leaves, there was a phone, dusty and cracked. I almost ignored it, thinking it was just junk someone left behind. But for some reason, I picked it up. The screen was damaged, but when I pressed the power button, it lit up. I didn't expect it to work, but it did. Curiosity got the better of me. The phone didn't have a passcode, so I unlocked it. The first thing I saw was a series of unread messages. They were short, desperate, and the timestamps showed they were sent over a year ago. Please, someone help me. I'm at the campsite, but I think someone is here with me. They're getting closer. I can hear them. Chills ran down my spine as I read through the texts. Whoever owned this phone had been terrified. There were also several videos in the gallery, so I played the first one. The screen flickered before showing a man's face, pale and sweaty. He was whispering into the camera, his eyes darting around like he was expecting someone to jump out at him. "I came here to get away," he said, his voice shaking. "But now, I think someone's following me. I don't know who it is. I've tried to leave, but I feel like I'm being watched. If you find this, please get help." The video ended abruptly, leaving me in silence. I was no longer enjoying the peace and quiet. My stomach twisted, and I looked around the campsite, suddenly feeling exposed. But I couldn't stop myself from watching the next video. This time, the man was outside, holding the camera close to his face. It was dark, and he kept turning the camera to show the shadows around him. "I've seen them," he whispered. "They're out there, watching me. I don't know what they want. I just want to go home." His fear was infectious. I started to feel like I was the one being watched, that at any moment someone, or something, would step out of the woods and grab me. I turned off the video and put the phone down, trying to shake off the unease, but it stuck to me like a shadow. The sun was setting, and I knew I should leave. This campsite didn't feel safe anymore. But as I gathered my things, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the videos. What happened to him? Where did he go? Did he ever make it out? I picked up the phone again, my hands trembling. I needed to know the rest of the story. The texts and videos painted a picture of a man who slowly lost his mind, convinced that someone was hunting him. Each message became more frantic, his pleas more desperate. In the last video, the man was running through the woods, the camera bouncing wildly. His breath was ragged and he kept looking over his shoulder. "They're coming for me," he panted. "I don't know if I can outrun them. Please, if anyone finds this, don't come here. Just don't." The video ended with a sudden thud, the camera hitting the ground. The screen went black, and that was it. No more messages, no more videos. The man just disappeared. I stood there, staring at the phone, my heart racing. The man's last location, it was here, right where I was standing. I looked around, suddenly feeling like I wasn't alone. The trees seemed to close in on me, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. Something was wrong. My mind raced, thinking about the fresh footprints I had seen earlier. They weren't mine. I was sure of it. Panic surged through me, and I started packing up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could hardly zip my bag. As I was about to leave, I heard it. A snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. My heart stopped, and I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the trees. There was no one there, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there, watching me, just like they watched the man in the videos. I didn't wait to find out who it was. I grabbed my bag and the phone and started running down the path, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made me run faster. I didn't care if I was running in the right direction. I just needed to get away. But as I ran, the footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. My mind raced with fear, imagining the worst. I could feel them getting closer, their presence heavy in the air. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. Finally, I saw the road up ahead, the end of the trail. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Just as I was about to reach the road, I heard it. The footsteps, right behind me. I stumbled, nearly falling, but I didn't stop. I made it to the road, my heart pounding, and kept running until I found my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine, speeding away without looking back. Even now, as I write this, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there. I don't know who they are or what they want, but I'm sure of one thing. The man in the videos wasn't crazy. He was telling the truth. And now, they know I found the phone. I don't know if I'll be safe or if they'll come for me too. But if you're reading this, please, don't go to that campsite. Whatever you do, just stay away. I've always loved hiking, especially in places where I can feel alone, away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. There's something calming about being surrounded by trees, hearing nothing but the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird. So when I heard about this remote forest that few people ever visited, I knew I had to go. The hike started just like any other. I parked my car at the trailhead and set off into the woods. The trail was barely visible, just a narrow path between the trees. But that was exactly what I wanted. The further I walked, the quieter it became. Soon, it felt like I was the only person in the world. As the day went on, I noticed something unusual. Up ahead, through the trees, I saw a campsite. This wasn't surprising by itself, but as I got closer, something felt wrong. The camp had several tents set up, and there were people around the fire, but they were so quiet. No one was talking, no sounds of laughter or conversation. They just sat there, staring into the flames or at nothing at all. I'm not a social person, but I figured it would be rude to just walk past without saying anything. As I approached, I lifted my hand in a casual wave and said, "Hey, how's it going?" No one answered. One of the campers glanced at me briefly, but then looked away as if I wasn't even there. The others didn't move, didn't react at all. They just sat there, like statues. Something about their behavior made my skin crawl. They weren't just quiet, they were completely detached. It was like they were in some kind of trance. I stood there awkwardly for a moment, waiting for a response that never came. Finally, I muttered something about getting back to my hike and quickly walked away. Even after I was out of sight of their camp, the uneasy feeling didn't leave me. I kept looking back, half expecting to see one of them following me, but the trail behind me was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I found a spot to set up my own camp, I made sure it was a good distance away from theirs. But as the night fell, the strange encounter stayed on my mind. Every little sound in the woods seemed amplified, and I kept imagining those silent campers creeping through the trees, watching me from the darkness. I didn't sleep well that night. Around midnight, I heard noises, rustling, footsteps maybe. It was hard to tell with the wind blowing through the leaves. My heart pounded as I strained to hear anything that might confirm my fears, but eventually the sounds faded, and I convinced myself it was just animals or the wind playing tricks on me. In the morning, I felt a bit foolish for letting my imagination get the better of me. I packed up my gear and decided to head back to the strange campsite just to see if they were still there. Maybe I'd misread the situation and they'd be more friendly in the daylight. But when I got there, the campsite was completely empty. Not just empty, gone. The tents, the fire, even the footprints that should have been left behind, everything was gone. It was like the campers had never been there. The ground where the tents had been set up was undisturbed, and the fire pit was cold and clean, without even a trace of ash. I stood there, trying to make sense of it. This didn't make any sense. I knew what I'd seen the day before. There had been people here. They couldn't just vanish without a trace, right? A cold chill ran down my spine as I searched the area. I found nothing. No signs that anyone had ever camped there. My mind started racing, trying to come up with explanations. Maybe they'd packed up and left early, but that didn't explain the lack of any sign they'd been there. Maybe I was in the wrong spot, but no. This was definitely the place. I couldn't have imagined it. I decided to explore deeper into the forest, hoping to find some clue to where they might have gone. The forest was dense and it was easy to get lost, but I kept my bearings, marking trees as I went. After about an hour, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a backpack, just lying on the ground, half covered in leaves. It was old and worn, like it had been there for a long time. Nearby, there was a piece of cloth caught on a branch, torn and faded. My mind went back to the campers. Could this have belonged to one of them? I didn't want to think about what could have happened. My heart was racing and I felt a growing sense of panic. I turned to head back to the trail, but as I did, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The forest was empty. But the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, getting closer. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I had to get out of there. I started running, not caring about the path, just trying to put as much distance between me and whatever was behind me. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps followed, always just behind me. Finally, I broke through the trees and onto the trail. I stopped, gasping for breath, and looked around. The footsteps had stopped. There was no one in sight. I wanted to believe I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I hurried down the trail, my eyes darting around, looking for any sign of danger. As I rounded a bend, I froze. Up ahead, on the trail, stood a figure. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but I could tell they were staring right at me. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to look away from the figure. I couldn't tell if they were real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but either way, I knew I was in danger. The story ends here because I don't know what happened next. Maybe I managed to get away, or maybe I didn't. But one thing's for sure, I'll never go back to that forest again. I needed a break from everything. Life was too much, and I wanted to escape, even if just for a weekend. That's how I found myself deep in the woods, far from any town or anyone I knew. It was perfect, or so I thought. I chose a spot near a small stream, with trees surrounding me on all sides. The air was fresh, and the only sounds were birds and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. After setting up my tent, I made a fire, and as the flames grew, I felt a strange mix of peace and unease. The quiet was almost too perfect, but I pushed that feeling away. I wanted to enjoy this, to forget everything else. The sun was starting to set when I heard a noise. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. It was the sound of something heavy moving through the woods, snapping twigs and crushing leaves underfoot. Before I could even stand up, a man stumbled into the clearing. He looked rough. His clothes were dirty and torn, and his face was covered in scrapes and bruises. He saw me and froze for a second before giving me a shaky smile. He said he was lost and had been wandering for hours. I didn't know what to think. Part of me felt bad for him, but another part was immediately on edge. I mean, what were the chances of someone just showing up here? I nodded and invited him to sit by the fire. He didn't hesitate. He dropped down close to the flames, rubbing his hands together like he was freezing. We didn't talk much at first. I was still trying to figure out how I felt about this. But he kept looking at me, his eyes almost too focused, too intense. As the night went on, the unease I'd felt earlier came back stronger. He started asking me strange questions. Where was I from? Did anyone know I was here? How long was I planning to stay? Each question made me more uncomfortable. I tried to keep my answers vague, but he kept pushing, like he was trying to figure something out. He even asked if I had a phone with me, and I lied, saying I'd left it at home. He gave me a weird smile when I said that, like he knew I was lying. The fire was dying down, and the woods around us grew darker and more silent. The man leaned closer, and I could smell the sweat and dirt on him. He started telling me about the woods, how easy it was to get lost, how people sometimes disappeared out here and were never found. His tone was strange, almost like he was enjoying the idea. I tried to laugh it off, but it felt forced. My heart was racing, and I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. He must have noticed my tension because he suddenly stopped talking and just stared at me. That's when he said it. He wasn't lost. He'd been watching me, waiting for the right moment. The smile on his face was gone, replaced by something darker, something hungry. My mind went blank with fear. I realized I was trapped out here with someone who didn't just stumble upon my camp. He'd been looking for me. I tried to act calm, saying it was getting late and maybe we should get some sleep. He just nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. I told him I was going to check on something in my tent, and as soon as I turned away, I knew I had to run, but I couldn't just bolt. He was too close. I needed a plan. I unzipped my tent, pretending to grab something, and then I heard him stand up. My heart was pounding in my ears. I turned around just in time to see him coming toward me, and I threw the tent flap at him and ran. I didn't stop to see if he was chasing me. I could hear him crashing through the woods behind me, getting closer. My legs were burning, and my breath was coming in sharp, painful gasps, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The trees blurred past me in the dark. I tripped over roots, branches slapping my face, but I didn't care. I had to keep moving. His footsteps were loud, too close. I zigzagged through the trees, hoping to lose him, but he was relentless, like he knew these woods better than I did. Maybe he did. At one point, I thought I lost him. The sounds of his footsteps faded, and I allowed myself to slow down. I listened, straining to hear anything, but it was quiet, too quiet. Then, out of nowhere, he was on me again, lunging from the shadows. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to dodge him, and he stumbled, falling to the ground. I didn't wait to see if he got up. I kept running, my legs screaming in pain, my lungs burning. Finally, I reached a part of the woods where the trees thinned out, and I saw the moonlight reflecting off the stream. I ran toward it, hoping that maybe I could follow it to safety, to somewhere I could get help. But just as I reached the water, I heard him again, closer than ever. He was right behind me, and I knew I couldn't outrun him forever. I turned, ready to face him, ready to do whatever it took to survive. He lunged at me, and I grabbed the nearest rock, swinging it as hard as I could. I didn't even feel it connect. There was a sickening thud, and then he was on the ground, not moving. I stood there, shaking, the rock still in my hand. I didn't know if he was dead or just unconscious, and I didn't wait to find out. I dropped the rock and ran. I kept running until my legs gave out, and then I crawled, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. Eventually, I found my way back to my camp, grabbed my bag, and ran to my car. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? Even now, I don't know if he's still out there, if he's dead, or if he's waiting for someone else. All I know is that I'll never go back to those woods. I'll never camp alone again. I decided to take a break from everything and go on a solo hike. The city was wearing me down, and I needed some peace. It wasn't something I usually did, but I was craving silence, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts. So, I packed my backpack and headed to a remote forest I'd read about online. It was supposed to be one of those hidden gems, beautiful, untouched, and, most importantly, quiet. After walking for a few hours, I started to feel the weight of the silence around me. The trail was well worn at first, but as I went deeper into the forest, it became more narrow and harder to follow. The trees grew thicker, their branches blocking out most of the sunlight. It was peaceful in a way, but also eerie. I began to feel like I was being watched, but I shook it off as just being out of my comfort zone. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A small cabin tucked between the trees, almost hidden from view. It looked old, like it had been there for years, maybe even decades. The wood was weathered, and the roof was covered in moss. There was something off about it, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. I was tired, though, and the idea of sitting down for a few minutes was too tempting to pass up. I approached the cabin slowly, half expecting someone to come out, but there was no movement, no sound except for the wind in the trees. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, it was dark, dusty, and smelled like old wood and something else, something rotten. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The cabin was small, just one room with a few pieces of old furniture, a broken chair in the corner, a table with peeling paint, and a bed with a thin, moldy mattress. The walls were covered in yellowed newspaper clippings and old photos. I went to the table where a pile of photographs lay scattered. They looked old, faded, the edges curling up. I picked up the first photo. It showed a family, a man, a woman, and two kids, standing in front of the cabin. They were smiling, the kind of smile that you force for a camera. The next photo was of a group of friends, all huddled together, again in front of the cabin. As I flipped through more photos, I noticed something strange. The people in the photos started to look different, not just in age but in their expressions. The smiles faded, replaced by something else, fear. I could see it in their eyes. They weren't happy. They were scared. One photo showed a man alone, his shirt torn, blood on his face. Another was of a woman with a bruise on her cheek, her eyes wide with terror. My hands started to shake as I went through the stack faster. Each photo was worse than the last. People with cuts, bruises, and some who looked like they were barely alive. And then I found the last one, but it wasn't a photo. It was an empty frame with a piece of paper inside. The paper had a message written on it. "You're next." My heart pounded in my chest. I dropped the photo and took a step back, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. What happened to those people? Were they victims of some kind of sick game? My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I had to get out of there, but as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a set of fresh footprints on the floor. They were leading into the cabin, not out. I hadn't noticed them when I came in. My breath caught in my throat. Someone else was here. I rushed to the door and yanked it open, not caring how much noise I made. I needed to get away, fast. The forest outside felt different now, darker and more menacing. I started running, but the trees all looked the same, and I quickly realized I had no idea which way to go. I could hear something behind me, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Someone was following me. I didn't dare look back. Panic set in, making it hard to think clearly. The trail I had followed so easily before was gone, swallowed by the forest. My legs were burning, but I pushed on, desperate to find my way out. The noises behind me grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they were gaining on me. I stumbled over a root and nearly fell, but caught myself just in time. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I was losing hope, thinking I might not make it out of the forest alive. But then, through the trees, I saw it, the trailhead, just a few hundred feet away. I forced myself to keep going, focusing on that one spot, that small chance of escape. I was almost there when I felt it, a hand grabbing my shoulder, pulling me back. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the forest. Everything after that is a blur. I don't remember what happened next. Maybe I fought back, maybe I didn't. All I know is that I woke up hours later, lying on the trail with no sign of anyone around me. I got up shaking and ran the rest of the way to my car. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was far away from that forest. I don't know who or what was in that cabin, and I don't want to know. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over, that they're still out there, watching, waiting for the next person to stumble upon that cabin in the woods. Last weekend, I decided to do something I had never done before: camping alone. I had read so many stories about people finding peace and clarity in nature, far from the chaos of everyday life. I thought it would be good for me, a chance to reset, clear my mind, and just be alone with my thoughts. So, I packed up my gear and drove to a remote area in the mountains, far from any other campers or hikers. The road was rough, and the trees thickened as I got closer to my chosen spot. It was perfect, or so I thought. I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. The sun was setting as I finished, and the sky turned a deep orange before it faded to black. The quietness was something I wasn't used to. It was almost too quiet, but I pushed that thought aside. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me because I was alone in the woods for the first time. As I sat by the small campfire I made, eating a simple meal, I tried to enjoy the solitude. But as the darkness grew thicker, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just nerves. After all, it was my first time camping alone. I laughed at myself and decided to get some sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound that sent a chill down my spine. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, circling my tent. The crunch of the leaves was unmistakable. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal, but the steps were too human. I lay there, frozen, listening. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just the wind, or perhaps I was dreaming. But the footsteps didn't stop. They kept circling, getting closer, and then moving away. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly unzipped the tent a few inches and peered out. There was nothing, no sign of anyone or anything. But the footsteps continued. I closed the tent quickly, my hands shaking. This wasn't my imagination. Something or someone was out there. The fear started to grow inside me, making it hard to breathe. Why had I thought camping alone was a good idea? I cursed myself for being so foolish, but it was too late to leave now. The footsteps came back, louder this time, as if they were taunting me. They would speed up, then slow down, changing rhythm like some sick game. I felt paralyzed. I couldn't move or even think straight. The sound was driving me mad. I knew I couldn't just lie there, waiting for whatever it was to find a way inside the tent. I had to do something. I reached for my flashlight and the knife I had brought along, more for comfort than anything else. I told myself I was going to scare off whatever was out there. I needed to believe it would work, or I would lose my mind. Slowly, I unzipped the tent again, ready to shine the light into the darkness and confront my fears. But when I stepped out, there was only silence. The woods around me were empty, just trees and shadows. I felt stupid standing there, knife in hand, shaking in the cold night air. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. That same cold, unsettling feeling I had felt earlier was now stronger. It made my skin crawl. I quickly retreated back into the tent, but the fear didn't leave. It stayed with me, wrapping itself around my chest, making it hard to breathe. Then, just as I thought the nightmare might be over, the footsteps started again. This time, they were closer, right outside the tent. I grabbed the flashlight, but my hands were trembling so much I could barely keep the light steady. I shined it towards the sound, but all I could see were the trees, tall and silent. My heart raced as the footsteps stopped right in front of the tent flap. I held my breath, knife gripped tightly in my hand. I didn't know if I could defend myself, but I was ready to try. For a moment, everything was still. Then, summoning all the courage I had left, I lunged out of the tent. But there was nothing. Just the cold, empty air. No footsteps, no person. Only silence. But before I could even relax, I felt something. A cold breath on the back of my neck. It was so close, I could feel the icy chill on my skin. I froze, too terrified to turn around. My mind was screaming at me to run, to do something, but my body wouldn't listen. I just stood there, every muscle tense, waiting for whatever was behind me to make its move. But nothing happened. The breath disappeared as suddenly as it had come. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, too scared to move or even think. When the sun finally rose, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as fast as I could and left that place, not daring to look back. As I drove away, I kept checking the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But there was nothing. Just the empty road behind me. Even after I got home, the fear didn't leave me. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those footsteps. Every time the house creaked or the wind blew, I felt that cold breath on my neck. I know it sounds crazy, but I can't help but wonder who or what was out there that night. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I ever will, because the question still haunts me. Will it come back? I was looking forward to a quiet weekend alone. The idea of camping in a remote spot, far from people, sounded like a perfect escape. I found a campsite deep in the woods, one that wasn't marked on most maps. That's what I wanted. Peace, no distractions. When I arrived, the place looked like a dream. Tall trees, the sound of a small stream nearby, and the smell of pine in the air. But something felt off the moment I stepped out of my car. The campsite wasn't empty, not exactly. There was a tent, half collapsed, with its stakes pulled out of the ground. An old campfire sat cold and untouched, with a few burned logs lying on the dirt. Someone had left food out, cans of beans, some bread, and even a half-eaten apple now brown with age. Everything looked like the people who were here before me had left in a hurry, without taking anything with them. I told myself they probably just had an emergency and had to leave fast. Maybe they were careless campers, not knowing how to properly break down a camp. But as I started setting up my own tent, I kept glancing at that abandoned one. It was bothering me. I decided to take a closer look. The tent was old, a bit torn, and inside were scattered clothes, a sleeping bag, and a flashlight with dead batteries. An open backpack lay nearby, with a few items spilling out, a map, some matches, and a journal. The journal was half buried under some leaves, as if someone had tried to hide it but didn't finish. My curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up. The first few pages were normal, talking about their hike, the beautiful scenery, and how excited they were to be away from the city. But as I kept reading, the tone changed. They started hearing things at night, footsteps around their tent, low voices they couldn't understand. They thought it was just their imagination or maybe animals. But the noises got worse, closer, and more frequent. The last entry made my heart pound. It's coming. We need to leave now. I stood there staring at those words, feeling the air around me grow colder. Something bad had happened here. The forest, which had felt peaceful when I arrived, now seemed oppressive, like it was watching me. The silence was too complete. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just the sound of my own breathing. I wanted to leave, but the sun was already dipping low, and I knew driving out of these woods in the dark wasn't a good idea. I told myself I was being paranoid. Whatever scared them was long gone. They probably overreacted to something silly. I could handle a night here. But as the night fell, my confidence started to crumble. The noises began softly, like someone stepping carefully on twigs, trying not to be heard. Every few minutes I'd hear a crack, then silence. My eyes strained to see outside my tent, but it was pitch black. The forest, once so welcoming, now felt like it was closing in on me. I thought about the journal again, about those last words. I tried to convince myself that I was being foolish, that I was letting their fear get into my head. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then, the breathing started. It was low, almost imperceptible at first. I held my breath, listening, hoping it was just the wind. But it grew louder, closer, until it was just outside my tent. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. The tent suddenly shook, like someone had grabbed it and was pulling on it violently. I was frozen, too scared to move, too scared to even scream. All I could hear was the heavy breathing and the sound of my tent being ripped apart. I knew I had to act. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold it, and I burst out of the tent. The light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The forest was still again, as if the last few moments had never happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there, just beyond the reach of my light, watching me. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to run as fast as I could back to my car, but my legs felt like lead. I finally made up my mind. I couldn't stay here. I started packing up my things, throwing everything into my backpack haphazardly. My eyes never stopped scanning the darkness, expecting to see something or someone emerge at any moment. As I reached to grab my last bag, I heard it again, a twig snapping, closer this time, right at the edge of the campsite. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, but all I could see were the trees, standing tall and still. But I knew something was there. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that primal fear that tells you when you're in danger. I slung the bag over my shoulder and started walking towards my car, trying to keep calm, trying not to break into a run. I was almost there when I heard it again. Footsteps, now following me, keeping pace with my own. I didn't dare look back. I just started running, not caring about the noise I made, just needing to get to my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with sweat, before finally getting the door open and throwing myself inside. I locked the doors and turned the engine on, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. As I drove away, the headlights swept across the trees, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just watching me. But I didn't slow down, didn't stop. I drove all the way out of those woods and didn't look back. I don't know what I saw, or if I saw anything at all, but I'm never going back there, and I'll never camp alone again. I moved into a small house near the woods a few months ago. It was quiet, peaceful, just what I needed. The forest behind my house was dense, untouched, almost like it was hiding something. I'd always been curious about what was out there. One afternoon, I decided to explore the area. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, just something to satisfy my curiosity. After walking for about an hour, I saw something unusual. There was a patch of thick bushes that looked different, like it had been disturbed recently. I pushed the branches aside and found a metal door hidden beneath the leaves and dirt. It was heavy, and when I pulled it open, the hinges creaked loudly, as if no one had touched it in years. Inside, there was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. My first thought was to leave it alone, but something pulled me in. Maybe it was the excitement of finding something hidden, or maybe it was the strange feeling that someone or something was watching me. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs. The air inside was stale and cold. The walls were made of concrete, damp and cracked, and the floor was covered in dirt. It was a small bunker with just one room, but what I found inside made my skin crawl. There was a makeshift bed in the corner, just a pile of old blankets and a thin mattress. Empty food cans were scattered around, and on a small table I saw some papers. They were covered in writing, but not in a language I understood. Still, there were a few words that stood out, words I recognized: watching, waiting, and my street address. I tried to calm myself, thinking it was just a coincidence, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Someone had been living here, someone who knew where I lived. And it wasn't just that. They had been watching me. I should have left then, but I was too curious, too scared to leave without knowing more. I searched the room, looking for anything that could explain what was going on. That's when I found them. Photographs, dozens of them, all of my house. Some were taken from the woods, others from right outside my windows. I could see myself in some of them, unaware that I was being watched. My heart was pounding. The photos were dated, and one of the dates caught my eye. It was the day I moved in. This person had been watching me from the very beginning, following my every move. The fear that gripped me was almost paralyzing. I had to get out of there. Back at the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I started noticing things that didn't seem right. A window I was sure I had closed was open. The back door was unlocked, and things in my kitchen were moved. I told myself I was imagining it, but it kept happening, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. One night, I woke up to a noise outside. It was faint, but enough to jolt me awake. I listened carefully, and then I heard it again. A soft crunching sound, like someone walking through leaves. My heart was racing as I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window. I could barely see anything, but I knew someone was out there. I should have stayed inside, but I couldn't. I needed to know who was out there. I slipped on my shoes and quietly opened the door, trying not to make a sound. The cold air hit my face as I stepped outside. I followed the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The footprints in the dirt were fresh, leading away from my house and back into the woods. I followed them, all the way back to the bunker. The door was still open, and inside, everything looked just as it had before, except for one thing. There was fresh food on the table, and next to it, a journal. I opened it, and as I read, my hands started to shake. The journal was a detailed plan, a plan to harm me. It talked about my routines, when I left the house, when I came back, and when I was most vulnerable. Panic set in, and I ran back to my house as fast as I could, not caring about the noise I was making. I just needed to get away. But when I reached my house, the door was already open. I froze, staring at the darkness inside. Someone had been in my house while I was gone. My mind raced as I stepped inside, closing the door behind me and locking it. Everything seemed normal, but I knew it wasn't. My skin prickled as I walked through the rooms, checking each one, expecting to find something, or someone, waiting for me. When I reached the living room, my blood ran cold. Scrawled on the wall in what looked like dirt were the words, "I know you're here." My breath caught in my throat and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My hands were trembling, and I felt like the walls were closing in on me. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed a kitchen knife and locked myself in my bedroom, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I tried to stay calm, tried to listen for any sound, but all I could hear was my own breathing, loud and ragged. The house was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, just outside my door, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there gripping the knife, but it felt like hours. And then, just as I started to think maybe I was safe, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting, praying that whoever it was would go away. But the door handle turned, and I knew I wasn't alone. We planned the hike months in advance, hoping to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with nature. The forest was remote, a perfect place to forget about everything. There were 4 of us: me, my girlfriend Lena, her best friend Jess, and Jess's boyfriend Mark. We were all excited, and the day was beautiful. We walked for hours, breathing in the fresh air, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of the wilderness. By late afternoon, we found a nice spot to camp near a small clearing. The sunlight streamed through the trees, and everything felt peaceful. We set up our tents, gathered some wood for a fire, and talked about what we'd do the next day. We were laughing, relaxed, and happy to be there. It felt like nothing could go wrong. As we started cooking dinner, a man walked into our camp. He was dressed like a park ranger, with a brown uniform, a hat, and a calm, reassuring smile. He introduced himself as Officer Daniels and asked how we were doing. He seemed friendly, knowledgeable, and like someone who knew the forest well. He told us about the area, warned us about wild animals, and advised us to be careful around the campfire. We were grateful for his advice, and when we offered him some food, he politely declined, saying he had to check on other campers nearby. Before leaving, he said he'd be around if we needed anything. At first, we thought nothing of it. Why would we? But as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness took over, something didn't feel right. It started as small things. Jess mentioned how the ranger's uniform seemed a bit off, like it didn't fit him properly. Mark noticed his accent was strange, like he wasn't from the area. Lena pointed out how he avoided some of our questions, changing the subject quickly whenever we asked about where exactly he was stationed. The more we thought about it, the more uneasy we became. I mean, what if he wasn't a real ranger? But what if we were overreacting? It didn't help that we were completely isolated, with no cell service and miles away from the nearest town. The realization that we were cut off from the world made the unease grow into fear. I couldn't sleep. The sound of every twig snapping outside made my heart race. Something was wrong, and I needed to find out what. Quietly, I slipped out of the tent, telling Lena I was just going to relieve myself. She nodded sleepily, not fully awake. I wandered a bit, pretending to look for a spot, but in reality, I was heading towards an old cabin we had passed earlier. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but I felt drawn there. When I reached the cabin, I hesitated before pushing the door open. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay and damp wood. Inside, I found a pile of old clothes, ranger uniforms, all worn out and dirty. There were fake IDs scattered across a table, each with different names but the same face, the man who had visited our camp. My stomach turned. There was also a map, with several locations marked in red, including where we were camping. Panic set in. This man wasn't a ranger. He was hunting us. I rushed back to the camp, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do. I couldn't let the others see how scared I was. I woke them up, trying to stay calm, but I must have sounded frantic because they were immediately on edge. I told them everything I had found, and we agreed we needed to leave immediately. Before we could pack up, he returned. The man who called himself Officer Daniels stood at the edge of our camp, his friendly demeanor gone. He looked at us with cold eyes, his smile twisted into something sinister. He told us we needed to leave the forest right away. When Mark asked why, the man's voice grew hard, almost threatening. But we didn't move. We couldn't. We were frozen in fear. His patience snapped, and he lunged at Mark, knocking him to the ground. The rest of us reacted on instinct. Lena grabbed a branch and swung it at the man, giving Mark enough time to push him off. The next few minutes were a blur of shouting, struggling, and pure panic. We managed to overpower him, but it wasn't easy. He was strong, crazed, like a wild animal. But finally, we tied him up with rope from our backpacks, breathing heavily, our bodies shaking with fear and adrenaline. We didn't feel safe leaving him behind, so we dragged him with us as we started the long trek back to civilization. The forest that had once felt peaceful now seemed hostile, every shadow hiding a new threat. We kept looking over our shoulders, fearing he might have accomplices or that he could somehow break free. The journey was agonizing, every step filled with dread. When we finally reached the edge of the forest, we saw real park rangers. I almost collapsed in relief. We handed the man over to them, explaining what had happened. They took him into custody, and we were safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling of horror that lingered in my mind. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about how close we came to being victims. I question everything, our decisions, our trust, and how easily someone can disguise themselves as something they're not. The line between safety and danger is thinner than I ever imagined, and I'm not sure I'll ever feel truly safe again. I went hiking alone that day, hoping to clear my mind. The forest was thick and quiet, with only the sound of my footsteps on the fallen leaves. It was the kind of peace you can't find in the city, where everything is loud and fast. Out here, it was just me, the trees, and the sky above. I don't know how long I'd been walking when I first heard it. A faint, desperate cry. I stopped, thinking maybe it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again, a little louder this time. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. My heart started to race. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a child. I couldn't just ignore it, so I turned off the trail and headed toward the sound. It took a few minutes of pushing through the underbrush before I saw something that made my stomach drop. There, huddled near a tree, was a small child. They were dirty, their clothes torn, and their eyes wide with fear. I crouched down a few feet away, trying not to scare them. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked softly. The child looked up at me, tears streaming down their face. They couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. "My parents left me here," the child whispered, their voice trembling. I felt a surge of anger and disbelief. What kind of parents would abandon their child in the middle of the woods? I reached out a hand, trying to be as calm as possible. "It's going to be okay. I'll help you find them, all right?" The child hesitated, but then took my hand. Their grip was weak, and they seemed to be trembling all over. I stood up, gently pulling them with me. "Let's go back to the trail. Maybe we'll find someone who can help us." But as we started walking, the child suddenly stopped. They looked over their shoulder back into the woods, their eyes wide with fear. "We have to be quick," they said, their voice barely a whisper. I frowned, looking in the direction they were staring, but saw nothing. "Why? What's wrong?" The child just shook their head and started walking again, a little faster this time. I followed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The forest, which had seemed peaceful before, now felt suffocating. The trees were too close, the shadows too dark. As we walked, I tried to make conversation, hoping to calm the child down. "What's your name? Where are you from?" But the child just kept their eyes on the ground, refusing to answer. They were so focused on getting away from something behind us that I started to feel uneasy myself. That's when I heard it. A soft rustling in the bushes behind us. I stopped and turned, but again, I saw nothing. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice shaking a little. The child didn't answer, just tugged at my hand, urging me to keep moving. My heart was pounding in my chest now, every instinct telling me to run. But I didn't want to scare the child more than they already were. We walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The rustling behind us grew louder, closer. My phone had no signal, and the trail I'd been so familiar with suddenly seemed strange, like it had changed while we were walking. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the child's fear was contagious. They kept glancing back, their eyes wide with terror. I didn't know what to do. We were alone, with no way to call for help, and something was out there, watching us. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped and turned to the child, kneeling down to look them in the eyes. You need to tell me what's going on. Why are you so scared? Who left you here? The child bit their lip, looking around as if afraid to speak. A man, they finally said, their voice so low I almost didn't hear them. He told me to wait here. He said my parents would come back for me, but they never did. My blood ran cold. What did this man look like? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The child shook their head. I don't know. He was tall. He said he was a friend of my parents. I felt sick. We weren't alone. Someone had left this child here on purpose, and I had walked right into their trap. We need to get out of here, I said, my voice trembling. We're going to leave the trail and hide, okay? The child nodded, and we started moving off the path, pushing through the underbrush. I didn't care where we were going anymore, as long as it was away from whoever was out there, but it was too late. I heard footsteps, fast and heavy, coming up behind us. I turned, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The child screamed, and I grabbed them, pulling them close, trying to shield them with my body. I couldn't see who was coming, but I could hear them crashing through the trees like they didn't care who heard them. My mind was racing, trying to think of what to do, but all I could think about was the child in my arms, shaking with fear. We were trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I could feel the child's small hands gripping my shirt, their breath hot and fast against my chest. And then, just as the footsteps were almost on top of us, everything went silent. The only sound was our ragged breathing. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. But whoever was out there, they knew we were here. They had been leading us all along. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the child's whisper, so soft I almost missed it. I'm sorry. Then there was nothing but silence. I've been camping alone for years. There's something about the solitude, the quiet, and the disconnect from the world that I find peaceful. I don't need much, just my tent, a fire, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. This forest was one of my favorite spots. It was deep, far from any town, and usually I was the only one around for miles. That night started just like any other. I set up my tent under a large oak tree, the leaves providing a natural canopy. The fire crackled softly, and I sat beside it, eating a simple meal. The night was calm, the air cool but not too cold, perfect for sleeping. The world felt right. As the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and settled into my sleeping bag. The familiar sounds of the forest at night surrounded me. Crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves, probably a rabbit or a deer. I was tired from the day's hike, and my eyes grew heavy quickly. Just as I was drifting off, I heard something. A soft crunch of leaves, then a faint, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps. I tensed up for a moment, but then reminded myself that I was alone. I'd heard noises like that before, Probably just an animal passing by. It was nothing to worry about. Still, my mind played tricks on me, making every little sound seem louder, closer. I shook it off, took a deep breath, and let sleep take me. I don't know what woke me up. It could have been a dream or maybe just the way my body shifted in the sleeping bag. But as soon as I opened my eyes, I knew something was wrong. The tent was too quiet, the kind of silence that made my heart beat faster, like it was warning me of something. Then I felt it, a presence. At first, it was just a feeling, like someone was watching me. I stayed still, my eyes scanning the darkness of the tent. My breath caught in my throat when I realized it wasn't just a feeling. There was someone, or something, inside the tent with me. My mind raced. How could anyone get in without waking me? I would have heard the zipper, felt the movement. I told myself it was my imagination, but the steady, quiet breathing beside me said otherwise. I tried to stay calm, to think logically. Maybe it was a prank, but who would be out here in the middle of nowhere just to mess with me? I hadn't seen a single person for days. My heart pounded so hard it hurt, but I didn't move. I didn't want to provoke whoever or whatever was next to me. I shifted slightly, hoping to inch towards the exit, but as soon as I did, I felt them move too. Just a small adjustment, like they were blocking my way out. I froze again, terror gripping me so tightly I thought I might pass out. My thoughts spiraled. Who was this person? Why were they here? What did they want? The minutes stretched on forever, each one filled with the sound of my own shallow breathing. I knew I had to do something, but what? My mind kept returning to the knife in my backpack, just out of reach. But would I have time to get it? What if they were faster, stronger? Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. The fear of the unknown was worse than anything else. I forced myself to speak, my voice barely a whisper, trembling with fear. "Who are you?" No answer. Just that quiet, steady breathing. It was like they didn't even care that I knew they were there. The silence that followed was suffocating. "Why are you here?" I asked, a little louder this time, my voice shaking. Again, nothing. No response, no movement, just that unbearable silence. I felt trapped, more so than I had ever felt in my life. My thoughts became a chaotic mess of fear and panic. Maybe this was some kind of nightmare, and I'd wake up any moment. But deep down, I knew this was real. I tried to think of what I could do, but every idea seemed impossible. The stranger was too close, too still. My mind kept screaming at me to get out, but my body wouldn't listen. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, to act, to even think clearly. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. It was hard to tell. All I could do was lie there, my body rigid with terror, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The stranger stayed silent, unmoving. Finally, as the first light of dawn filtered through the thin fabric of the tent, the stranger moved. It was a slow, deliberate movement, the sound of the zipper being undone sending a fresh wave of fear through me. They slipped out, leaving the tent flap open behind them. I didn't dare move until I was sure they were gone. When I finally got the courage to sit up, I was alone. The air inside the tent was cold and still, but outside, the forest was waking up, birds chirping in the early morning light. I stumbled out of the tent, expecting to see something, footprints, a sign, anything to prove what had happened, but there was nothing. No trace of anyone ever being there, just the same empty forest I had always loved. Only now it felt different, tainted by the terror of the night before. I packed up as fast as I could, my hands shaking the whole time. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from there. As I walked, I kept looking back, expecting to see someone following me, but there was no one. just me and the trees. To this day, I don't know who it was or why they came into my tent that night. But the memory haunts me. The quiet breathing beside me in the darkness, the feeling of being completely helpless. It's something I'll never forget, no matter how far I go.